This is Roger Stone for American Sovereign Bullion. Since 2020, the U.S. dollar has lost over 20% of its purchasing power. Meanwhile, gold continues to rise. Call 844-272-2428 or go to asbgold.com now to get your free gold and silver guide and learn how to protect your wealth with physical gold and silver delivered to your door or held in a gold IRA today. So go to asbgold.com now. Don't wait for the markets to drop. That's asbgold.com.
Listen, all you New Yorkers. Excuse me. Taxi.
Okay, man, we're looking around.
This is the 77 WABC minicast.
Happy Easter Sunday to you. Really got to dig deep and dive into this issue. The New York Times is claiming their constitutional rights are being attacked. Their First Amendment rights as a media organization. Democracy's dying in darkness. It's all crumbling. Everything's horrible. The world is falling. I don't know if that's entirely true, though. So apparently, when Secretary of War Pete Hegseth came in, they made some changes to how the press could access the Pentagon. Gee, really? You think maybe from a security reason that might be a good idea? Anyway, to break down what's really going on, I want to bring in Navy JAG officer, all-around good guy in the civilian world, managing partner of the Parlatore Law Group, Commander Tim Parlatore. Tim, good to be with you. Thanks for joining us on this Easter Sunday.
Hi, good morning, Sean.
Good morning. So for those of us who aren't watching the situation, let me just start with this. I want you to paint us a picture. When the media, prior to Secretary Hegseth coming in as Secretary of War, right, walk us through real quickly what the situation was with the press with respect to access to the Pentagon.
So when we came in, the press had free reign over the entire building. They couldn't necessarily get into locked offices or spaces where classified material was, but free reign over all the hallways. They could just walk in and swipe in the front door and just wander around. If they wanted to spend all day just camped right outside the secretary's door, they could. Camped right outside the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff door, they could. Watch everything that's going on, see who's coming in and out, eavesdrop on conversations in the hallway. And they were open about this. Barbara Starr, talked very openly about how
CNN
got a lot of her news. She would she'd walk around the hallways and then just talk to people and try and get them to tell her things that were going on, non-public information. And, they also didn't have any identifying badges or anything that would let you know who they are. So I remember, very early on in the administration, I was walking down the hall with the then acting general counsel of the department, Charlie Young. We were having a conversation, obviously nothing, classified out in the hallway, but I realized that this guy walked up right next to us and I looked over. I happened to recognize him, that he was a journalist. If I hadn't recognized him, I would have thought it was just another, department employee just, going on his way. And as soon as I recognized the guy, I said, Charlie, let's talk inside, because that's what they were able to do back then. And it was
but just to add, so someone's listening and saying, okay, so they can walk around a building. As far as you know, though, is there any other government building in the executive branch that's possible?
No.
Okay.
It's not possible on any other military base. It's not possible in any other, department headquarters. It's not possible at the CIA headquarters, main justice. And also, and this is an important point, it's also not something that you can do if you are a military officer who's not assigned to the Pentagon.
Explain that.
So any other military member, if you're not assigned to the Pentagon and therefore have your key card, keyed so that you can swipe in, everybody else has to get a day pass. They have to undergo a background check. Even though they have a top secret clearance, they have to undergo the background check by the Pentagon Force Protection Association. And then when they show up, they may or may not have unescorted access. So even admirals could potentially show up and get a red badge and have somebody escort them around. Now, the Pentagon's kind of a confusing building, so it's not necessarily a bad idea for a visiting officer to have a red badge and an escort. But We give journalists more free reign over the Pentagon than we give our own military members who possess top secret clearances.
That's important to understand. I mean, I want to break down two things. The first one, and I hadn't heard this before, I hadn't thought about this before until you just said this.
Yeah.
If you are a journalist and you drive up to Fort anything, Fort Belvoir, Fort Bragg, Fort Myers, Fort Dixon, or any naval base, and you say, "Hi, I'm with the Washington Post. I'd like to come on base." They can't just do that.
Correct. No, they have to be pre-cleared. They have to have an authorization from the PAO's office. They often will have escorts. I remember when I was trying the Gallagher case out in San Diego, they used to gather them outside the gates, and then they would escort them in, kind of in a group, and they would have minders to make sure that they stayed within that general vicinity of the courthouse. They couldn't go wandering around the piers or where the ships are or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, that's the way it is everywhere else, everywhere but this one building.
Yeah, so that's the military side. And then I wanted to hit on the executive side, because again, this is so important what you're saying. If you go to the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Energy, all the way up to the White House, you don't just get to wander around. If you get access, you're either escorted in, or in the case of the White House, and I can speak to that, obviously, you get a badge, you get to go into the press room. They've got a little workspace in the back, and that's it unless you're escorted.
Correct.
Well, I mean,
exactly.
This is what I find so fascinating about this, is the one place, maybe outside the Department of State, but let's be honest, I don't know even half of those people know what they're doing there. The Department of Defense is where our war plans are. It's where our classified information is. And yet we are the most open and free with that one agency than all of the rest. It seems ironic that that's the case.
It is. And that was the shock that Secretary Hegseth had when he came into the building. Yeah, even having a career in media such as he did, he walked in and he thought, how is this possible? Who allowed this?
What dope did that? So let's get to the brass tacks then. So he walks in, he sees this, he says, who's the dope that did this stuff? Like, these are our war plans. And I mean, to your point, what people have to understand, I think, and I apologize sometimes if we overlook the obvious, but like, if you sit outside the chairman's office or the secretary's office, it's like sitting outside the president's office or any other principal. If you see 10 people from the Indo-PACOM area rush in, you're going to be like, something's happening there. Something's going on there. Or, you see a bunch of your folks, the JAGs run in, someone's going to get in trouble. Something's bad's happening, right? There's someone who broke the law or is getting, you can start to put get the breadcrumbs together, and you can't do that anywhere else. So you guys recognize this problem. Hegseth says, "Hey, Parlatore, get over here. What the hell's happening?" And then, so what do you guys propose? What is it that you say, here's how we should operate going forward?
So the initial draft policy came out in September. It was drafted by career Pentagon lawyers. It was not as tight as I would have liked. And so it was open to misinterpretation. So we then adjusted it for the October version, which was much more explicit in what the restrictions were. So first we had kind of restricted that they couldn't access the whole building. They were only able to get into certain areas. And of course, you may recall there were all the articles at the time about the unprecedented assault on the First Amendment by, restricting them to certain hallways. Then we put out this policy that, made them have to wear badges that clearly identified themselves as media. And,
wow.
and then we put in more, robust, security measures that said what they could or couldn't do in the building. And, so we wrote it in a way that would protect all First Amendment protected activity, all legitimate news gathering activities. However, it was written to restrict their ability to engage in things that fall outside of those constitutional protections. And really
like
where this comes down to is there are laws that Congress passed, not the Pentagon. Congress passed laws criminalizing certain conduct by government employees. And so if a government employee releases classified information, that's a crime. if they release something called controlled unclassified information, that's a crime. Basically, the disclosure of any non-public, confidential government information that has not been cleared for release by the appropriate authority is a crime by a government employee. And so what we did was we put it in there that, hey, if you're going to have access to the building, you cannot use that access to go up to people in the hallway and ask them to commit a crime.
Fair enough, right? So in other words, I can't ask you to break the law and to give me something that I shouldn't have.
Correct. And to be
Fair.
clear, there is, the Constitution has absolutely protected journalists who receive unsolicited information. If the Pentagon Papers was the case that the Supreme Court focused on this. If a department employee approaches a journalist and says, I would like to hand you this top secret document, the journalist is well within their right to receive it, read it, publish it, put it out on the internet, do whatever they want with it. They are constitutionally protected in that way. But that's based on the department employee approaching them and offering it. If the journalist were to turn to a department employee and say, hey, I would really like to get my hands on this, can you go get me a copy? Now the journalist has solicited criminal activity, which is itself a crime. Now we kind of sidestepped that piece of it. Like we didn't want to put it into the policy that the solicitation of criminal activity is itself a crime, because that's not something that is our job. That's a Department of Justice call, and so we wrote this policy to specifically only address that, hey, if you do these things, you're going to lose your access to the building. We didn't want to scare people with, if you do something like that, we're going to make a criminal referral or something like that. And we don't want to. That's not our focus. Our focus is just on protecting the information. And if you're the type of journalist that's doing that type of activity, then we just don't want you in the building.
Okay. And again, all common sense makes sense. How does the media react to that? How do they, what is there? Because again, the way you hear this, and this is the way I open this segment, they said, oh no, they're asking us to approve our stories. We're going to write a story about Hegseth policy, and then we have to submit it to somebody at the Pentagon for approval. That's not true, correct?
This is how they earn the nickname fake news. That's totally false.
I think they earned it a few other ways, but
believe it or not, that was the policy for many years. The policy for many years during World War II is a credentialed journalist signed an agreement where they would submit their stories to the Department of War's Office of Censorship for pre-publication review. So that used to be the policy, but it hasn't been the policy since the 40s. So,
right. But under the policies that you guys put forward to them, that was not the case, right?
No, it never was the case. What they've done.
Well, that goes to this question, which is then they what? They went to court and said what?
So they didn't bring that argument up in court, but basically what they did in court, which is what they've also done in in their op-eds, is they take the policy and they have creatively reimagined things to try to twist the meanings of things and make it cover things that it does not cover. So they went to court and essentially argued that our regulations about don't solicit somebody to commit a crime in the hallway means that if they attend a press conference, that they're no longer allowed to ask the secretary or the chairman questions during the press conference, which is so far outside the realm of plausibility. Right. It's got nothing to do with anything that we put into that policy. It's completely insane. But all of this litigation has been over these constitutional provisions that, quite frankly, I agree with. Most of what the judge and the plaintiff's lawyers said, I agree with those constitutional provisions. I just don't agree that it is in any way tethered to this policy. Yes,
okay, so the New York Times,
no problem.
Of course, sure. I don't think anyone has a problem with that. And we can always say no or no comment. And
Correct.
and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary Hegseth and some of these briefings have said that the President of the United States will say it. I'm not going to tell you that. He loves saying that. So the court,
Right.
they go to court. The New York Times sues you guys. The judge rules at least somewhat in their favor in the sense that, again, I don't think it was on the merits of the case, but so where do things stand? What did the judge say you guys have to do? And then what have you done?
So what the judge did was very abnormal. He ordinarily, what a judge would do is they would vacate the policy. They'd say, this policy is unconstitutional. Here's why I think it's unconstitutional. And they would kick it back down to the agency to say, you have 7 days to write a new policy that, that conforms with my guidance, essentially.
Okay.
The judge here decided not to do that. He took our policy and did the judicial equivalent of a line item veto, where he just went through and every paragraph that the New York Times didn't like, he just struck it out. And so he essentially took our policy and said, you have to give them access, but everything about security, information security, all that stuff, and anything having to do with, accountability or, what do you do if somebody breaks the rules? We're going to just get rid of all those sections. And then he said, now this is your new policy that has zero security protections whatsoever. Now you are required to immediately issue passes to all the New York Times journalists.
Okay. And what'd you do?
So what we did in response is we spent the weekend. He issued that on a Friday afternoon. New York Times wants their passes back Monday morning. We spent all weekend rewriting the policy. And so Monday, we put out a new revised policy that took every single thing the judge said and incorporated it in. And which ultimately, it required it to become much longer, where the sections, for example, the one we've been talking about, do not solicit, this information. We rewrote it as the intentional inducement of unlawful activity. And we made the description much longer. And then every single creative misinterpretation that the New York Times journalists and the judge came up with, we put them all in a list. And we said, to be clear, it does not mean this. It does not mean this. It does not mean this. And so we rewrote the policy so that it would very, very, very specifically focus on the things that we have legitimate security interests in, and then disclaim all of their fanciful interpretations. So, and what's
them to a new space, right?
Did that, right. Well, yeah, that's the other thing we did is we also moved them to a new space because of all of this back and forth and all of the issues of the court trying to get rid of our security measures. Something that we had planned anyway. In fact, something that we had telegraphed in the original policy was that we were going to move Correspondence Corridor and get them a new space that had better Wi-Fi access, that actually held cell phone reception. And so we implemented that. And so we moved the press office out of the main building into an annex. And when I say annex, it's about 30 feet away from the building. It's not that far away. In the library and conference center, into a space where they actually have cell phone reception. So it's actually a better space for them. And we then said, when you come in the building, you're going to have an escort. We made it the same as the White House, as every other executive branch building. And they immediately ran back to court to say, making the Pentagon look like every other executive branch building is an unprecedented assault on the First Amendment.
Of course. Yeah, we can't be like everyone else. Let me ask you the real question, though, which is sort of like in business, they talk about like KPIs and all this. Like, has the amount of leaks and classified information gone down since you did this?
Significantly. Massively.
That
ultimately... This, we didn't just change things because the secretary looked around the hallways and said, wow, that's weird. Yes, he said that's weird, but we didn't change it immediately based on that. We would have done that the first week if that was the cause. No, we saw significant, serious, classified information walking out of the building. And it was weekly, sometimes even daily, that Sean Parnell would get calls from journalists, particularly the New York Times, giving almost real-time updates on things that had happened in classified briefings and saying, hey, we heard that, fill in the blank here. And it was insane. But the moment we implemented this new policy in October and all these journalists voluntarily turned in their press passes and deported themselves out of the building, it stopped dead.
That's what matters.
Sure that there have still been some leaks of classified information, but the frequency has gone down massively. Yeah. So the policy works.
Well, look, I mean, that's what matters, Tim. That's what matters. I appreciate you being with us on this Easter Sunday. Thanks for your service to the country. Thanks for what Secretary Hegseth and the whole team there at the Pentagon is doing to keep us safer as a country, prosecuting this epic Fury operation. Again, I appreciate it. Thanks for everything you're doing. Thanks for your time this morning. You've been listening to Full Court Press with Sean Spicer here on WABC. We'll be right back after the break.
This is Full Court Press with Sean Spicer on 77 WABC.
This is Greg Kelly. Donate now to Toys for Tots, which works year-round. Go to toysfortots.org. Toys for Tots supports children in need throughout the year with programs like the Toys for Tots Literacy Program. Established in 2008, it has provided over 63 million books to disadvantaged children. The Toys for Tots Literacy Program is committed to providing disadvantaged children with direct access to books and educational resources that enhance their ability to read and communicate effectively. Go to toysfortots.org.